This is Navigating the Middle Market, a podcast by Pitcher Partners that tackles the make or break moments every successful business leader faces when taking your business to the next level. On the show, we'll talk to experts who'll share actionable insights to help you navigate the common pitfalls you'll experience when scaling up. I'm your host, Anna Hacker. Today we're chatting with Jason Fallscheer. Jason is a client director here at Pitcher Partners Melbourne. For over 20 years, Jason has been helping business owners take their businesses to the next level, from business loans to property investments. He has worked with businesses of all sizes to find smart solutions, leading to him being an all-round Broker of the Year finalist at the 2024 Connective Excellence Awards from Australia's largest aggregator. In this episode, Jason will cover the pros and cons of choosing a bank and taking on debt, using your house to secure a loan, and how to mitigate the risks as your business grows. Let's jump in. Hi, Jason. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me, Anna.
Absolute pleasure. I'm very interested in understanding all things debt. And so really to jump right in, why is it important to get your banking set up correctly as a growing business?
Look, I probably use the analogy of measure twice and cut once. The reality is that if you've got a business and you're planning to grow it, getting your plumbing right at the start about where your accounts are, how you're going to receive payments, whether it's credit card or direct payment, a lot of people are going to have access to that account number. So if you get that right at the start, you don't need to change it, and it avoids that massive inconvenience down the track. When you set out in business, you want your infrastructure to be set up and reliable so that it's no longer a distraction from really what you're there to do, and that is to sell a product or provide a service.
I love that analogy, and I think that it's very similar in most cases to do with most parts of business. You want to get it right first.
Yeah, and I think the main thing is when you're doing anything in life, you've got to surround yourself with the right expertise. And a finance broker and a bank are part of that, I believe, and particularly because a lot of people will think I can stretch my working capital a long way, but the reality is that not everyone pays on time. Sometimes you need to load up with people or stock, and having a way to fund that is really important because otherwise you've got a short-lived business and a lot of stress.
And so what sorts of things do you absolutely need a banker for rather than just using cash?
I think number one, you need a banker if you haven't got enough cash, but I think also to give you the guidance as to how you might look to protect yourself. So for example, if you're setting up a small retail store, you might need to pay months and months of rent in advance, but you can maybe replace that with a bank guarantee, which means you're not tying up as much cash. You might be importing from overseas, and rather than sending the money overseas and hoping that the stock arrives, you might get a letter of credit, which means that you're not really releasing that money until it's really clear that those goods are shipped to you. You might not have received them, but they're at least on their way to you through a reputable transport company before you actually release the payment. A good bank and a good banking relationship should actually help you mitigate some of the risks involved in getting started when you're building those relationships. Because later on down the track, when you've been dealing with someone for a long period of time, a lot of the contracts in life aren't as important, but it's really important at the start that you safeguard yourself from a lot of those potential pitfalls where you might get defrauded or taken advantage of because of your inexperience.
And therefore having people that know how to do the things you need them to do are important very, very early on.
And part of that is you might think I've got a bank where I've got a home loan, but they might not necessarily look after your business. And then you really need to choose someone that can sustain you for a period of time. If you've got growth plans that are beyond your current bank or banker's capability, you need to start thinking about who's going to look after me if I grow to where I want to be. So there's no point thinking I'm going to stay with a bank that doesn't offer, whether it be asset finance, working capital like debtor finance, those sort of things. If you think you might need them one day, it's important to get started and stay with someone that you think you can build and grow with and has a business mindset similar to yours.
And having that circle of support around you, I think, to grow your business, I presume that having the banking side set up is where you're going to have a lot less stress when you have a bit of pressure financially.
Absolutely. And I think being in business, it's a lonely place. And as a banker and a finance broker, what you often do is you get to know a lot about someone's personal circumstances, their growth, their aspirations, what's happening in their family. And quite often they don't have anyone in their day-to-day business that they can actually talk to because most of the people are actually working for them. So what you need in a business banker is someone you can ring up and say, hey, this is going well, and you can sort of celebrate with them. But the other side of the coin is if something's not going so well, you can ring up and say, I need help, and hopefully that bank and the people around you can support you to get to where you want to be without it being a critical moment where you feel isolated.
And have those honest conversations so that you can feel supported and actually be supported when you need it.
Yeah, and I think it's important to have the conversation so that you can temper your own natural enthusiasm and say, this is possible. If you're going to do this, we need that. And it could be a case of if you're going to grow to a certain stage, we need to have your house as security. We won't release that house as security until you get past a certain stage, whether it be profitability or turnover. And understanding that up front is really important because you might be a small business person jointly owning a property with a spouse. And the question will be, do they need to come on board as well because they need to provide guarantees and link to that property? And if that's not available within the relationship or there's not property assets around, then it's important you navigate to where you can still get supported. It might be more expensive, but there are other options outside of just thinking about it one way, which is I've got to do everything myself and I'm not going to get any help.
It's interesting that you use the example of the home because I presume a lot of business owners do just turn to their home initially to secure that debt. What is it that is a risk or a benefit of using a home that you've seen?
Well, the benefit that jumps off the page, Anna, is cost. If you secure a debt, it is generally significantly cheaper than what it would be being unsecured. In the early phase of a business's career, putting a property up might actually be the only way that you can get access to reasonable cost funds. And the market's really developed over the last few years to say that a lot of the businesses that have traded for 6 months might be able to get access to sources of funds just using bank statements. But unless the ABN's been registered for a couple of years and your turnover's really kicked in, a lot of those funders will say no because the algorithms that they use rely upon turnover through the bank statements to predict risk. So when people are deciding how they're going to go about it, whether they're going to use their property, that advantage is it gets them access. It does mean that things are tied up and it leverages your property. But in reality, if you've, whether it's in a company or individually, got money from a financial institution, the likelihood is that they've taken a guarantee from you anyway. So people might be comfortably thinking, I haven't pledged my home as security, but I've given a guarantee. Well, if worst case scenario occurs and that business fails, they'll act under your guarantee and look to recover against your assets personally, which will probably mean that you'll end up using or losing the home anyway.
So we talked about the more obvious probably things that you need a banker for, but what are the maybe less obvious things that people might not even realise they need a banker for, things like letters of credit?
So just to explain a little bit about what a letter of credit is, if you think about the average person that starts thinking, oh, I'll set up a shop and start selling product, they may have a local supplier where they're buying something from within Australia. Typically that means that they either pay for the stock up front or they get an account and they might have between 30 and 90 days to pay for it. At some point, you'll realise that most of that product is being imported from overseas. Now, you've got the option here of paying for that overseas directly, whether it be a bank transfer or putting it on your personal credit card or a business credit card, but it doesn't leave you with a lot of protection. What a letter of credit will do is will allow you to say, we promise to pay, but we don't release the payment until such time as the exporter, for example, in China or India, has lodged their documents with the shipping agent to say that that's been stocked and shipped and it's on its way to Australia. So basically, once it's left the country of origin, we're free to pay in most circumstances, but we're also reasonably certain that the shipping line is going to deliver it to us. And what that does is give people protection that they're more than likely to get what they've paid for. It also means that you're not spending cash day one. You might be releasing the cash on day 30, 60, 90, up to 180 days, which means that you, in the best case scenario, can receive the goods, process them through your distribution centre, or maybe put them in your store and sell them. You may even convert them to cash before you need to pay. And that's the real advantage of trade finance and having a letter of credit, because it means that you're not always having to pay for everything up front, because most businesses don't work on the basis that they've paid for all of their stock. Part of their working capital cycle is that they will take advantage of these types of instruments to allow themselves to grow and have more stock than they have just paid for. In the absence of things like trade finance and the proper documentation, you may well pay away for that stock and receive it. The best example that I know of, which is one that a lot of the banks will talk about, is that a client might be importing fertiliser. How do you know that it's fertiliser or dirt? If it's shipped, it'll weigh the same, but unless it's tested and has the appropriate certification with it, which a banker will insist upon before they release the money, then you could be importing a pile of dirt, which has actually happened on a number of occasions. Because ultimately, if the supplier in China, for example, has been paid for that product and they're really only interested in a one-off transaction, they can be exposed to that sort of stuff, which having good support around you will actually help you avoid. And it will help the business take the next phase, because once you get comfortable with importing, you'll start to expand your product range, because you can actually start to go to those countries and design product and then give yourself a real point of differentiation in the local market compared to everyone else that's doing something you do. You might be able to home brand. You might be able to differentiate enough for the product to be seen as more of a value add, and then you start to be able to build in margins that you otherwise can't do by just wholesaling local product and retailing locally.
How do banks' requirements change as your business changes and let's say you're no longer paying PAYG?
I think the main area, and this is about having the right people around you, is that rather than going to the bank and saying how many times of my pay can I get as a debt, and that might be for a home loan, and that might be at the moment, say 5 times, they'll look at your forecasts, and having good people around you to help build a forecast that the bank can rely upon is really important. The longer that you're in your business, you need to make sure that you're continuing to pay your taxes as they're due. And that's all forms of taxes, including your GST and your superannuation levies and those sort of things. And in a lot of circumstances, you'll think, I don't know that I've got the time, or my business is big enough to employ a financial controller. And that's where they might use an outsourced finance team to help them on a day-to-day basis, just raise invoices and make sure that everything's up to speed.
And so then taking a step back, or maybe a step forward, some business owners may choose to pay themselves a wage, a PAYG wage. What sort of implications does that have?
Probably 2 years, it's become more and more valuable for a business owner to pay themselves a wage, in particular if they're planning on improving or upgrading the home that they live in. Because previously you'd basically say to a self-employed person, until you've been in business, you've got 2 years financials, we can't get you a home loan. Or we'd go down what we call a low doc path, which is more expensive. What the banks have now come to a conclusion on is if you're paying yourself a wage, the assumption is your business can afford it and will treat you like a normal salary earner, provided you are paying your pay-as-you-go tax and you're paying your superannuation contribution for you as an individual salary earner. The main consideration there is, can your business afford to pay you the level of wage?
And so then how can you ensure that your business is financially prepared for growth and expansion?
I think the main thing there is know that you've got a product that has room for growth. And I think it's important that early indications of your business rolling out are pleasantly surprising you. What I've seen over the years is a number of people that say, I think I can be this big, but their sales don't grow quickly to that point. So don't scale up until you've got overwhelming momentum behind you, because we can all plan to be successful, but we've actually got to be successful to continue to invest and grow, because otherwise you can find yourself digging a reasonably big hole, and that is that you've got overheads such as rent and wages and other items that aren't compensated by turnover and profit being made. So I think the key thing there is just make sure that you're realistic about how well your business is going, and really look to outperform your own targets before you continue to grow and plough more in. Because what you don't want to do if you've built up a good business is to try and expand too quickly, because we use a term in banking and finance called overtrading, and that can mean that you've tried to stretch too much out of your business. So you might have tried to expand too quickly. You might have employed too many people. You might be selling but not making a lot of profit. And I think the important thing there is just be patient, because the best business people take time and make sure their model's really solid before they expand. And when you expand, you've got to have the right people behind you and the right amount of financial stability behind you to make sure that you can fund what you need to do to take the next step. And that might be that you need more premises, it might be you need more stock, more people, but just do that on the basis of you've been successful until that point and you're then taking the next step what we see a lot is people doubling down thinking we just need to build scale and then it'll work. It rarely happens that way. It's generally success, then grow, as opposed to doesn't quite work, and then grow.
So you mentioned the importance of having a buffer. It sounds like it makes sense, but can you unpack what the importance of a buffer is for businesses that are expanding and growing?
I think when I refer to having a buffer, I look back to the cash flows that you receive from a business that's about to go into their next 12 months of business operation. And they might do a cash flow forecast and say, if I sell this much, if I hold this much stock, I've got an overdraft limit of, say, $1 million. Is my peak utilisation in that cash flow going to be 800,000 or is it going to be 1.1? When I say you need a buffer, I would hope that you can operate successfully on that 800,000 and leave the top part of your facilities, the top amount of cash you've got available to you, free for an emergency or a rainy day. The challenge you have in business is if you're thinking, I need everything to go to perfection to stay under that limit, generally people will trip themselves up and find that they're really pushing up and straining their cash and straining the relationships they have, because they might be ringing people that have been good customers of the business and saying, can you pay us sooner? And it's not a great position for a business to be in. So I would say from a financial perspective, you should have a buffer in the limits and not plan to use all of the cash or all of the facility that you've got. I flow that through to security as well, because what you want to know is that if you ring the banker and there's been a situation which is beyond your control, say, for example, one of your major clients, their CFO has an illness and doesn't make the payment run on a Friday and you've got to pay wages. You want to know that if you ring up your banker and say, I need to go $100,000 over, they've got the comfort on their side of things to say yes. Not that you've wound everything up so tight that they can't give you $1 more than what they have in limit. So I think overall it's important you have a buffer, and that comes down to when you're planning to stock your store, you've got enough stock if someone comes in and makes a big order and you're not thinking of now unable to replenish. That's a bit about being conservative, but it's also more about being well planned and building sensitivity into what you're doing so that you know that if you're really successful, you can cope with it. And if you're not so successful, you can cope with it as well. I use an example here of if you're an ice cream store and it rains every weekend, you need to make sure that you can open the doors when it comes to the sunny weekends, because that's when you're going to make your money. And that's probably a good analogy for when you need to just make sure you've catered for all contingencies. And overall, if you've got good people advising you, but also you start with a plan of being successful, building and growing, as opposed to just trying to really expand quickly with a scattergun approach, you will have a longer term sustainable business.
And clearly planning is pretty critical to all of this, having proper plans in place.
And taking the time out. Like I've been in situations where clients will invite me to their planning days for the part of the session that they're talking about finance, because they know that ultimately I'm going to be arranging that funding for them. So if there's a possibility that they need extra buses in a fleet, or they're thinking about building a new depot, or they're thinking about opening new stores in a retail environment, you need to bring these people into the tent. But also what that means is when you're having the next conversation, that person is able to say, where are you at with this? So it holds you accountable. The more people you involve, the more system checks you've got in place for people to hold you accountable. Are you on track? Do you need this? I've referred before to business being a lonely place for a business owner. If you don't share that problem that you have, there's a saying that a problem shared is a problem halved. If you don't share that, then ultimately you'll spend a lot of time being introverted, and most good businesses have got great stakeholder engagement because they engage with their audience and they really proof test and check everything that they do to make sure it's going to work. And you can't do that by yourself looking in the mirror.
And probably pretty importantly, no surprises then for people, no sudden cash flow issues or huge amounts of stock that can't move. You need people to understand what the future looks like and why it's set up in that certain way.
In particular with businesses with stock management, it's amazing how often people hold on to stock, and you walk through a factory and you've got lines and lines of great stock, and then you look in the back corner and you go, what was that? quite often the business owner will say to you, I had this idea and it didn't work. Quite often those ideas are the ones that were lonely and didn't have a lot of support amongst the group, and the business owner, to their credit, has just forged ahead. But it's important that people take stock of those mistakes and realise I wouldn't have made that same mistake twice, or if they did, they own it and get rid of it. So if a store's not working in a certain location, change it or close it. It's akin to people managing their personal investments. Quite often people sell the asset that is going really, really well, but they hold the one that they think is going to turn around. And a lot of people have got those in their share portfolios where they've seen a share just go sideways for years. It's similar to businesses. If you've got a site, if you've got a product, you've got to make sure that it's continually attractive to the market. You can't always force yourself on the market. Very few people and a lot of money through influencers can't sell certain products.
And so I guess thinking about risks, are there steps that you can take to try and manage risks?
I think from a financial perspective, the main thing you do is you test your market. It's important that if you're going to a new product line, that you engage appropriately and asking your advisors, would you buy this? If you're appealing to a kids market, would your kids buy this? Asking your family and friends, what do you think about this is really important. I think that a lot of people will attend trade shows and get feedback from the market, but I think the main risk is you can't be too invested in one strategy, because if you are and someone identifies that opportunity and competes with you, then you're in a difficult position. So I think having multiple avenues to making profit and keeping your business sustainable is important. And what I've seen over time, and this is no disrespect to the major retailers in Australia, like your Bunnings, Kmart's, Woolworths, Coles, quite often you'll see businesses that come for financial assistance say, I've got a big order for one of those groups. And then they'll realise that 70 to 80% of their turnover is linked to that supplier. Now, there's no obligation for that supplier to continue to supply for that product. There might be a category where they've got a number of options. That's a real risk situation where only certain businesses will have the courage to say, I can't afford to have that concentration. And they'll be disciplined enough to say, we need to build outside of that. In that circumstance, you go down one of two paths. You say, we're going to hook a ride to the major retailer and we're going to supply as much as we can to it. The wise business will say, we want to do business with those major retailers because they deliver our product to market, but we need at the same time to run just as hard, if not harder, with the alternate suppliers in case that contract disappears at some point in time. And I think that having people around you, whether it's a board, family members, good advisors, are the type of people that will hold up the risks to people and help you work through them. Because if you're in the business alone, you might just grab that opportunity and think, I'm just going to ride it for as long as I can. And even though during the period of time it's really great and you're making lots of money, when it stops, it can be really disastrous. So I think the important thing there is know that not everything lasts forever. So plan to be in a situation where it's not quite as good as what it could potentially be when you start out.
And is there a difference to mitigating financial risks?
I think the key thing here is when you're making money, and let's face it, most people go into business to make money. Very few people just do it for a lifestyle change. The important thing for me, and I'm a conservative ex-banker, is when you've got the opportunity to pay down debt and don't buy toys. I just came from a meeting recently where one of my colleagues was talking about funding a boat, and it was really hard to fund because banks don't like toys. Banks judge you for having toys. If you drive to the office of a banker and you're driving a flash car and you're then saying, look, my cash flow is really tight and I'd like an increase, which might be causing them some difficulty, what does the banker really think? They're driving a nicer car. They're nicer than the banker's driving, probably. They can't afford it, yet they're asking us for money. What other things in their life are they doing that they can't afford? So I think being conservative and banking profits when they occur and then growing conservatively is important, as much for future-proofing yourself, but also there's an element of not getting distracted from the main game, and that is to have a highly sustainable business that is de-risking itself, because not everything will last forever.
Well, that sounds like a top tip, listeners. Don't drive the Maserati to the bank.
Indeed. And certainly don't ask them to lease one.
So how can assembling a professional services team, Jason, including an accountant, lawyer and finance broker, benefit a person's business?
I think as I alluded to before, when you've got the network of you in business, you might be really good at your product or your service. But if you need access to someone that might talk to you about property, those people in your professional network will take you to a real estate agent. They might take you to a valuer. They might link you to a property developer if you've got something that you want to develop. So the opportunities expand the more people you've got around you and the more people that you've allowed to be open with that know that if the right opportunity comes to share network, that's great as well. And that's really what I think really good business people do, and that is that they're reasonably open about what they're doing, not giving away their trade secrets, but they're open to network, and there's nothing wrong with exploring an opportunity with someone new.
It sounds like the role of the finance broker is pretty critical to have in the kit bag for growing businesses in particular.
Look, I think so. And the stats show that over the last 5 years, market share for home loans has moved over 70%. More than 7 out of 10 home loans are written by a finance broker. In the business world, that's lagged, but it's now up beyond 60% of new deals being written in the finance market are done by finance brokers. Part of that is also the huge diversification in the finance market where pretty much within recent memory, you went to a member of the big 4 banks in Australia or there are a few other bit players. Part of a finance broker's role is to make sure that they know of the literally hundreds of finance suppliers that they can go to, whether someone needs particularly working capital support, whether they're doing property development, because the banks have essentially abandoned parts of the market that don't work for them and allowed others to step in.
Well, I can see how critical your role is, Jason, with your clients. And I would love to thank you for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Anna. Appreciate you having me.
You've been listening to Navigating the Middle Market. This podcast is brought to you by Pitcher Partners Melbourne. To learn more about how Pitcher Partners can help you scale your business, head to our website, pitcher.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Navigating the Middle Market, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your podcast app. And while you're there, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps others to find the show. I'm Anna Hacker, and I'll see you in the next episode.